The third floor of Zenith Care Central Hospital in Baltimore was always spotless, so pristine that one could almost believe everything here was flawless. But to Dr. Grace Ellery, the most perfect thing about this place might have been how smoothly people looked the other way. At 63, she still arrived at the hospital every morning before 6 a.m., still wore her white lab coat with fraying hems, still walked in her worn orthopedic shoes, shoes that had carried her through an arthritis flare-up during a winter shift back in 2009. No one asked her to come this early, no one thanked her for it, and somehow that no longer saddened her. Everything had become a ritual. She entered, clocked in, exhaled lightly behind her medical mask, and began yet another invisible day. Zenith Care was not a public hospital. It was, as the media team described it, a premium medical facility integrating cutting-edge technology. And that showed in every detail. Facial recognition replaced attendance sheets, fingerprint-resistant glass walls, LED panels at every patient bed. But beneath all that futuristic gloss was something ancient Grace knew all too well: hierarchy and the quiet dismissal of the elderly, especially the elderly who dared to speak up. Grace was once head of the medical ethics department, a role that didn't sound impressive in an era where data and speed were prioritized over humanity. She had authored much of the hospital's original code of conduct, but now she saw it referenced only as a guideline. The younger doctors called the principles she built outdated protocols. They didn't say it to her face. They said it next to her, as if she were an old coffee machine. There, but irrelevant. This morning, as she approached the nurse's station, her eyes caught a freshly posted sign on the announcement board, bold black lettering on deep orange. Optimizing life-saving efficiency. Beneath it, a chart tracking patient discharge rates by week and month. A young doctor, tall and neatly groomed, beamed when he saw her. "We're rolling out a new protocol, Doctor Ellery," he said, gesturing to the chart like he was pitching a startup. "Reducing average hospital stay to 2.7 days. No more excess paperwork. Cleaner data streams. Leaner operations." Grace looked at the chart, then at him. "Does that include skipping the discharge consultation between doctor and patient?" The young doctor shrugged, as if trained to answer that question with polished indifference. "We're flexible depending on the case. Only when absolutely necessary." She said nothing, just stared back at the poster, as though willing it to vanish if she looked long enough. As she turned away, a small sound echoed from the end of the hallway. A senior patient who had just undergone surgery was coughing repeatedly. Grace immediately pivoted and hurried toward the noise, ignoring the eyes that followed. No one said a word. No one stopped her, but no one helped either. At the far-end room, Mr. Daniel, 72, post-gallbladder surgery, lay on his side, gripping the blanket edge, breathing with difficulty. She checked the monitor, adjusted his oxygen, and gently placed her hand on his chest. "Mr. Daniel, I'm Doctor Grace. Are you all right?" He nodded faintly. His eyes were moist, not from pain but emotion. "Doctor, they said I could go home today, but I still hurt. No one checked. They just signed the paper." Grace gave his hand a firmer squeeze. "I'll take another look at you. No one should go home before they're ready." Leaving the room, she headed straight to the office of the primary physician, the one who signed the discharge. The door was slightly ajar. Inside, laughter. A group of young doctors were watching videos on their phones, chuckling like every case was a segment on a late-night show. Grace paused for a few seconds, then knocked softly. A man turned, his face still wearing a trace of amusement. "Oh, hello, Doctor Ellery. Is something wrong?" "Patient Daniel, room 309. I don't believe he's ready to be discharged." He raised an eyebrow. "We based our decision on clinical recovery metrics and protocol 3.1. No abnormal signs. We need the bed." Grace's voice remained steady. "I suggest reevaluating that decision, or at the very least, ensuring a proper checkup before he leaves." The room shifted. A young female doctor whispered something to the person next to her. The attending physician nodded. "Thank you, Dr. Ellery. We'll take it under consideration." She'd heard that line dozens of times, and it always meant, "We'll ignore it." Grace returned to her small workspace, if it could be called that. It was a corner beside the old record storage, with a faded wooden desk and a chair without wheels. On the wall still hung a blurry printout of the ethics code, one she herself had written nearly 20 years ago. An old nurse once joked, "Your office looks like a forgotten reading nook." She had laughed then, but not this time. Opening her laptop, the first email she saw was about the new Clean Cut protocol, a system meant to shorten treatment duration and reduce staffing costs. Attached was a list of doctors prioritized for trial participation. Her name was absent, naturally. Below that, an email from a young doctor, accidentally forwarded to her, discussed how to make Dr. Ellery feel included without giving her too much say in the project. She read it, then closed the laptop. That afternoon, while reviewing a file on a patient with complications due to early discharge, the door creaked open. A man, Asian, mid-40s, walked in. He wore a white shirt and a temp badge that read, "Interpreter, temporary." He gave a polite nod. "Good afternoon, Doctor Ellery. I'm Marcus. I was assigned to help translate for a Vietnamese patient today. But before that, I wanted to ask you about the hospital's patient record system. I heard you're quite familiar with the older processes." Grace looked up, slightly surprised, then nodded gently. "Have a seat." That was the first time they spoke, and it was also the first time in years she felt someone was listening, not interrupting, not pretending to jot notes, not rushing to end with, "I'll take that into account." She didn't know it yet, but the man sitting across from her was memorizing every word, every name, every tremor in her voice, like someone quietly gathering the broken pieces of a system no one else wanted to fix. Marcus Lee was unlike the typical newcomers seen at the hospital. He wasn't flustered, nor was he overly verbose. Despite wearing a badge that read "Interpreter Temporary," every step he took carried a quiet intentionality, as though he hadn't come to learn the ropes, but to absorb everything with all five senses. After his first conversation with Grace, he didn't rush to take notes. He simply nodded gently and thanked her in perfect American English, neutral in accent but spoken with the deliberate calm of someone who observed more than he spoke. Grace looked at him with a hint of suspicion. She knew nothing about him, and with a lifetime of experience, she had learned to be cautious around those who appeared overly respectful. That noon, Marcus was assigned to the internal medicine admin team for his shift. His job, officially, was to assist a Vietnamese-speaking patient struggling post-surgery. But instead of just fulfilling his translation duties, Marcus used every second in the waiting room, hallway, and elevator to observe. He didn't miss the head nurse's dismissive glance when a poor patient asked for a second blanket. He didn't overlook how the attending physician brushed off a family member's request for a clearer explanation of post-op risks. "Let them ask, they won't understand anyway," a young doctor muttered as he left the patient's room. Marcus heard it clearly, not because he was standing nearby, but because he had long been attuned to the kind of soft remarks that cut the deepest. All afternoon, Marcus remained composed. He continued in the role of interpreter, assistant, someone on the margins. But every time he glanced back down the corridor, his gaze settled on one familiar corner, where Dr. Grace Ellery sat hunched over patient files, or quietly followed an elderly patient to testing, as though she were still the lead physician, even though her name now only appeared under the title part-time ethics consultant. After a brief exchange with the Vietnamese patient, Mr. Lam, 67 years old, who had recently suffered a minor stroke, Marcus turned to the attending doctor. He says he still feels numbness in his left hand and is worried because no one has explained the risk of recurrence. The young doctor, eyes on his phone as he signed off paperwork, replied, "Tell him we've done everything we can. If they want more details, book a follow-up. I've got 8 more patients." Marcus said nothing. He nodded, returned to Mr. Lamb's room, and sat down to slowly and clearly explain everything in Vietnamese. Not because it was his job, but because he had once seen his own father, also an elderly patient who didn't speak English, discharged early after heart surgery, without anyone bothering to explain the consequences. As he stepped out of the room, Grace was standing in the hallway. It wasn't clear when she had arrived, but her eyes said she'd been watching long enough. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. Marcus looked at her and nodded. "I know, but maybe sometimes someone has to." In that moment, nothing more was said, But something had formed, not a relationship, but an anchor, a silent tether between someone who had long been rendered invisible and someone now pretending not to matter. That night, after finishing his shift, Marcus returned to the short-term apartment he'd rented near the train station. He opened his laptop and began recording every situation, every name, every word. He wasn't writing a report. He was drawing a map of how a modern system could so easily forget the most basic principles of medicine, listening and respect. And at the center of that map stood an older woman in a frayed white coat, still quietly walking the hospital halls, like a resilient white shadow no one bothered to see. 2 days later, the hospital underwent a sudden internal audit. From early morning, all electronic dashboards flashed pale yellow alerts. Urgent equipment inventory, complete by 5 p.m. today. Staff across all departments were ordered to review every medical tool, especially those related to post-op monitoring and critical care. The tension in the air was taut like a stretched wire. Grace received the internal bulletin via email like everyone else. But as always, she wasn't invited to the related professional meeting. Still, out of habit, she arrived early and went straight to the post-op recovery supply room to check inventory herself. In the third cabinet, where there should have been at least 4 wireless SpO2 monitors, only one remained. She made a note. No speculation. Just the item codes, the last update date, and sent an email to the technical supervisor. By 10 a.m., no response. By noon, when she stopped by the tech office to ask in person, the supervisor, a man in his 40s with a badge that read supervisor, replied with thinly veiled sarcasm, "Dr. Ellery, you haven't managed the equipment inventory since 2021, right? I thought you stepped back from that stuff." Grace merely nodded. "I'm just reporting what I noticed. We might need it tonight in case of a post-op emergency." He looked at her for a second, then turned away. "We'll handle it, thanks." She left, no argument. That afternoon, a patient came in from a liver surgery, a complicated case requiring at least 12 hours of continuous monitoring. When the nurse went looking for a wireless SpO2 unit, only one was available, and it was already in use. The attending physician glanced at Grace, even though she wasn't on duty for that case. "Looks like you called it, but if you knew the equipment was short, why didn't you report it earlier to the attending?" The remark hit like a blade wrapped in calm. Marcus, standing near the patient intake area, happened to hear everything. His eyes landed on Grace's face. Not angry, not defensive, just a silence so cold it was chilling. That evening in the staff cafeteria, the story began to spread. The old doctor who keeps meddling in the process. Some used the word troublesome. Others called it taking on someone else's job. A young nurse even smirked as she recalled, "She came asking about equipment like she still ran the place." Marcus sat quietly at a table near the door. He heard every word, memorized every face. That night he opened his private log, where he had been gradually building a map connecting behaviors, authority, and neglect. At the center of that map, he added a new red node: device missing, warning ignored, patient nearly affected, blame shifted to Grace. The deeper he went, the more clearly he saw the signs of a system that wasn't just failing to listen, but actively choosing to ignore those who pointed out the flaws. The next morning, Grace returned to the archive room to review the previous month's equipment logs. She had once overseen the inventory system and still had access to printed records. Flipping through the March report, she spotted something off. 4 SpO2 devices had supposedly been issued to a special surgery case, but there was no return record. And most notably, the signature of confirmation belonged to a technician who had resigned 2 months earlier. The report had been forged, not blatantly, but just enough to be caught by someone who paid attention. She backed up the file, printed a copy, and quietly filed it into her personal folder. No one knew what she'd discovered. She didn't tell Marcus either, but from that moment on, something shifted in her eyes. Less wary, more resolute. That afternoon, during an internal meeting between doctors and nurses, the recovery unit manager, Riley, a sharp woman in her 30s with the cadence of a TED Talk speaker, smiled as she said, "We need to optimize treatment efficiency without letting emotions interfere. Unauthorized staff checking equipment is something we need to clarify to avoid misunderstandings." No one named Grace, But everyone knew. Some glanced her way. A few frowned lightly. Some shook their heads as if she were the last obstacle to a new, lean, efficient system. Grace said nothing, but Marcus, standing at the end of the hall, watched in stillness. At 6:35 p.m., that same day, the alarm blared in the surgical wing. A young patient who had undergone a laparoscopic stomach procedure showed signs of complications, oxygen loss, and unstable blood pressure. As doctors rushed to retrieve an extra monitor, a nurse screamed, "No backup, SPO2 machine available." Marcus stood by the door. He didn't move. His hands clenched his clipboard until his knuckles turned white. Over the next 10 minutes, staff scrambled to call support from other units, eventually hauling in a monitor from the ICU. The patient was stabilized, 22 minutes after the episode began, nearly 15 minutes slower than the safety benchmark. When things calmed down, Marcus walked down the hallway, returned to the records room, turned on his laptop and typed, "We just witnessed a consequence. No longer theoretical. The lack of equipment wasn't an accident. It was orchestrated." Beneath that, he wrote a name for the first time, in bold, Grace Ellery. Not the one at fault, but the only one who had warned them, and who was blamed. 3 days after the equipment shortage incident in the recovery unit, the hospital seemed to have returned to normal. Morning briefings resumed on schedule. The internal bulletin proudly noted a 0.4% increase in patient satisfaction, and the coffee machine on the third floor still ran out of creamer, just like always. But Marcus sensed something was off. Not because patients were complaining, not because an investigation had been launched, but precisely because nothing had happened. No internal report, no incident log, no apology, no one held accountable. That evening, while passing through the admin wing to return a document translation, Marcus heard laughter echoing from the frosted glass conference room, the one typically used for executive meetings. The door was ajar. Under soft yellow lights, 5 people sat around the table. The chief medical officer, the assistant director of administration, a PR consultant, and 2 technical managers. They were laughing heartily about something described as a heroic equipment response in a time-sensitive situation. One person mimicked a voice. "Good thing the patient didn't drop dead, or we'd be going viral and yanking press releases." The room erupted in laughter. Another voice, female, added, "I just updated the system records so the device shows as under maintenance. That way no one can ask where it went." More laughter. Marcus stood outside, unmoving. His grip tightened around the folder in his hand, his palm damp with sweat. The door clicked shut. He walked away, never looking back. The next morning, Grace received an email from HR. She was summoned to a review of internal coordination procedures, not allowed to bring legal representation. Subject: conduct beyond assigned scope. The meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. She wasn't surprised. She quietly printed the email, folded it, and placed it in her old document pouch. Marcus heard about it through a nurse. When he saw Grace in the hallway later, she gave a faint smile and said nothing, but her eyes were no longer silent. They held the quiet resolve of someone who had long accepted what was coming, that she would be removed, but not quietly. The following day, during a closed-door leadership meeting, the deputy executive director introduced a draft titled Silent Workforce Restructuring Strategy, a name that sounded harmless, but in reality was a roadmap to eliminate staff deemed no longer aligned with the new efficiency model. Marcus caught a glimpse of the document on the printer tray as he passed the print room. One of the names listed for position review, Grace Ellery. Beside it, a note, potential reputational risk due to emotional internal commentary. He didn't take the document. He memorized it, every word. Marcus began arriving at work earlier and staying later. He no longer wrote post-shift reports. Instead, he drew maps. On those maps were faces, actions, moments of blame deflection, all translated into symbols and dense lines. Grace was no longer just a character in the story. She was the center, the lone indicator that medical ethics still existed, even if buried beneath titles and polished metrics. And perhaps for that very reason, she was the one who needed to be eased out quietly. On Friday afternoon, Grace stood at the far hallway behind the ICU, peering through the glass at an elderly patient slowly recovering from heart surgery. She was no longer directly treating patients, but still showed up to check on them each day. She signed no logs, claimed no credit, filed no reports. She simply sat quietly, sometimes holding a patient's hand if they seemed scared. Marcus stood at the other end of the hall saying nothing. For the first time, he noticed a slight bend in her posture, not from age but from the invisible weight pressing down on her shoulders. That weekend, the hospital held its Internal Inspiration Week event, celebrating individuals deemed motivational figures. Grace's name was not on the list. The host was a young doctor recently promoted, the same one who once interrupted Grace during a feedback session, saying, "We can't hold back just because older staff feel uncomfortable." As the room stood and applauded, Marcus stepped backward, quietly exiting the auditorium and headed straight to the records office. He powered up the computer and downloaded every file related to the recent surgery case, including device inventory logs. Within 3 minutes, he found 4 separate data edits made by the same technical staff account. He also recovered a deleted internal email, still retrievable from the system's auto recovery function. Its content: remove the device from the temp list. Don't let Grace keep asking. The signature belonged to one of the people laughing in that meeting room days earlier. Marcus didn't print it, didn't send it. He saved it to a separate hard drive. The folder name: not a story, a system. That night, Marcus opened all of his notes, not to add more, but to delete the opening section. He replaced it with a single line: "This is no longer an observation. This is a testimony." Monday morning, the sky over Baltimore was veiled with a thin layer of gray, like someone had sketched mist onto the glass of reality. In the hallway on the 7th floor of Zenith Care Hospital, everything was spotless, orderly, and far too quiet. The third door from the elevator, room 7.4, was noted in the email Grace Ellery had received 3 days earlier. Internal Coordination Review Meeting. No legal representation allowed. Begins at 8:30 a.m. She arrived at 8:12. Not early enough to draw attention. Not late enough to raise concern. Same old white coat, faint blue ink stains on the cuff. No makeup. No presentation slides. Just a single folder and a gray plastic ballpoint pen. When she entered the room, 5 people were already waiting. The Deputy Director of Human Resources, the Head of Clinical Coordination, a representative from Safety Compliance, an in-house attorney who said nothing the entire meeting, and a mid-level staff member labeled meeting recorder. None of them stood to greet her, just curt nods, like receiving an employee who'd botched a spreadsheet. "Thank you for arriving on time, Doctor." "Ellery," began Rena Caldwell, Deputy Director of HR, early 50s, navy blue blazer, eyes cool and practiced behind slender glasses. "We hope today's exchange will be honest, constructive, and to the point." Grace nodded, no smile. Not too quick, not submissive, just steady eye contact. "There are a few recent incidents we need to clarify," Caldwell continued. "Specifically, Dr. Ellery, in your capacity as a part-time ethics consultant, you accessed the post-op medical supply room without prior notification to the supervising department. Furthermore, you intervened in the treatment of patient Henry Castillo, though you were not assigned to that case. This, we believe, may disrupt internal workflows and reduce cross-departmental efficiency." Grace didn't react. She reached into her folder and pulled out a printed copy of the equipment audit email, one sent to the entire hospital that morning. The line "applies hospital-wide, all personnel responsible for assistance" was bolded. She placed it on the table, said nothing, waited. The safety compliance representative frowned. Caldwell leaned forward slightly. "Dr. Ellery, we don't question your sense of responsibility. This is about conduct, not intention. We acknowledge your efforts, but it seems, perhaps, you haven't fully understood that your role is no longer one of leadership." "I understand my role very clearly," Grace replied evenly. "I didn't propose changing the protocol. I simply asked where the equipment was." A simple statement, but no one responded right away because there was no flaw to twist, no angle for blame. The safety rep interjected, slightly irritated, "But your questioning made some nurses feel pressured. We have records showing tension and a breakdown in coordination following your involvement." Grace looked straight at him. "Instead of asking why I raised the question, Has anyone here asked where the equipment actually went? Silence. At that moment, the door opened. Marcus stepped in. No one in the room knew who he was. No one realized that the temporary interpreter badge he wore was the final disguise of a CEO in plain sight. He gave a polite nod. Apologies, I'm not scheduled on this agenda, but I have a document that you might want to review. He approached the table and placed down a small black USB. It contains inventory access logs, real-time edit timestamps, and internal system login data. Also, an email that was deleted but preserved by the backup system. Every modification occurred after Dr. Ellery's initial report, not before. Caldwell stared at Marcus. And who are you? I'm someone who watched everything she did, every step, every word he paused, and never once saw anyone break protocol, only someone trying to preserve the conscience of medicine inside a system that's trying to erase it for the sake of speed and metrics. The room thickened. No one spoke. No one touched the USB. Grace remained seated, eyes fixed on Caldwell. I don't need anyone to speak for me, she said. I've already prepared to step away, if that's what it takes for you all to feel secure. But before I do, I want to ask, one last time, does anyone here care whether that patient was monitored with a faulty device? Did anyone ask why the equipment was missing, instead of who asked the question? No one answered. Marcus walked out first. Grace followed a few minutes later, never looking back. That same afternoon, the hospital's internal newsletter made no mention of the meeting. None of the department heads mentioned her name, but in the waiting area of the recovery ward, a small slip of paper appeared on the bulletin board. Handwritten blue ink. Recognition isn't always necessary, but doing the right thing always is. No signature, but every nurse there knew who wrote it, and quietly they left it up, though it wasn't part of official policy. That afternoon, after the disciplinary meeting ended in silence and without any official record, the sky didn't rain, but a thin golden dust of sunlight blanketed the back courtyard of the hospital, a place few people visited. There was no air conditioning, no Wi-Fi, no sleek signage like the employee cafe on the 5th floor. Just an old dark brown wooden bench, paint peeling at the right armrest, and next to it, an ancient oak tree with roots protruding above the ground, like deep wrinkles etched by time. Grace sat there. No more white coat, just a faded gray sweater and worn fabric trousers with frayed pockets. She leaned slightly forward, hands clasped over her knees, eyes fixed on the stone pavement, with an expression that was neither tired nor sad, but more like someone weighing memories. Marcus walked over from the service wing, holding 2 paper cups, 1 black tea, unsweetened, and 1 black coffee. He didn't have to ask which one she'd prefer. He sat down, said nothing for the first few minutes. Just placed the tea in front of her, kept the coffee for himself, and took a quiet sip. They could both hear the distant wail of an ambulance and the caws of crows on the roof across the courtyard, but neither paid them any mind. No greeting, no exchange of glances. Their presence alone was enough. She was the first to speak. Did you know this used to be the psychological recovery garden? Marcus nodded slightly but said nothing. She continued. Back in the early 2000s, this area was for patients who had gone through long treatments, cancer, cardiac, organ transplants, somewhere to rest, to meditate, to learn to slow down. Then it was shut down due to insufficient budget. I was one of the people who fought that decision. I wrote 3 petitions, 2 clinical essays, and sat through 2 hearings. What did I get in return? I was asked to step down as chair of medical ethics for failing to adapt to the new financial model. Marcus wasn't surprised. He had suspected she wasn't just an older doctor clinging to old ideals. But this was the first time he heard her speak of failure. Not bitterly, not with rage, but like someone who had learned to live with her scars. She smiled faintly, a kind of smile stripped of flavor, then sipped her tea. After that, I asked to be reassigned as a part-time consultant. They agreed, probably hoping I'd fade out quietly within the system. I accepted, because I thought as long as I stayed, I might still protect a few things. 1 patient not discharged too early, 1 young nurse not replaced by a machine. I knew I couldn't save everything, but I thought Maybe if I stayed long enough, I could save just one. She paused, looking at him. But eventually I realized I was wearing away. Marcus set his cup down, still holding the lid. His gaze dropped to the cement where a single oak leaf lay motionless. I don't think there's anything wrong with wearing away if you're being worn down by something worth holding on to. That made her look at him longer than before. Not because she was moved, but because she was surprised. She hadn't expected someone under 30 to say that, like he was living it. She asked plainly, "Who are you really?" Marcus sat still for a few seconds, then smiled, not to deflect, but like someone about to tell a long story. "I grew up in an immigrant family. My dad worked in a factory. My mom was a medical office assistant. Both were once denied care because their insurance didn't cover enough. I remember seeing my father wait 3 hours in an emergency hallway only to be told, 'You need to be transferred.' And I swore, if I ever got a seat at the table where decisions were made, I'd do it differently." Grace didn't interrupt. Marcus continued, "I studied finance, then pivoted into health tech, worked in hospital data analytics. 10 years ago, I co-founded a platform integrating smart hospital operations. Later, I invested in a small hospital chain in Oregon, then expanded into 7 states." He paused, eyes steady. "I'm the financial backer behind the Zenith Care Network." Grace tilted her head slightly. "So you're—" Marcus nodded gently. "I'm not a translator. I'm the acting CEO of this entire hospital system, at least on paper. But I never trusted KPI reports. I wanted to know how my system actually worked, not through PowerPoints, but through patients' eyes, through the way staff behaved." He stopped. "And that's how I met you." A breeze swept by, stirring a few strands of Grace's hair. She didn't look shocked. She didn't look impressed. She just looked at him, long and still, and finally nodded. "I figured. I just wasn't sure which side you'd be on." Marcus nodded. "I'm not sure either. But today I think I at least know what I have to do." No more words were needed. On that old wooden bench, someone who had been ground down by the system and someone who had once built the system sat side by side, not as winner and loser, but as two human beings who understood that some things couldn't be measured by metrics or meeting notes. Only by the eyes, like the way they looked at each other, in a late afternoon that was neither too bright nor too sorrowful. 1 week after the conversation beneath the oak tree, at exactly 7:04 a.m. on Monday, every internal inbox across the Zenith Care network received an email with no subject line, no visible sender, no logo, no signature. Just a single attached PDF file named 04 Protocol Reconstruction.pdf. The body of the message contained only one sentence. "No one needs to shout to speak the truth, but everyone deserves to hear it." Within 30 minutes, the email had been opened in over 60% of the network's branches, from Baltimore to Seattle, from ICUs to basement archives. What stopped people wasn't the language, it was the format. The document read like a strategic report, but it had no title, no corporate branding, no headers, no footers, no author attribution. It didn't belong to any department, yet it contained information so precise, down to the exact timestamps and names, that it couldn't be ignored. What stunned readers most was the level of detail. 5 exact instances of inventory data manipulation, 2 undocumented administrative meetings, 3 patient complaints about denied follow-up care, and 1 near-fatal incident officially logged by the hospital as stabilized without complication. The final page featured a comparison chart between the organization's founding values and its actual behaviors over the past 6 months. No summary, no call to action, no moral sermon, just a single quote, centered and alone at the bottom. "A system is only strong when it dares to face what it tries to hide." At Zenith Care's Denver headquarters, an emergency meeting was convened at 9:30 a.m. Every senior executive, including the heads of communications, legal, and IT, was present. Rena Caldwell, Deputy Director of Human Resources and the one who had chaired Grace's disciplinary session, was the first to speak. "This is an internal leak, but the greater danger is it has no source." The IT director followed. "The document was sent through a temporary encrypted server. The trace deleted itself after 30 seconds. No IP log, No trace in our security system. Another voice chimed in, could be a disgruntled IT staffer. But no one bought that. If it were just a rogue employee, they wouldn't have access to this many data chains. And if it were someone internal, they wouldn't have sent it without absolute certainty. Slowly, eyes began to shift around the table. Briefly, subtly, but enough to shift the temperature in the room. Meanwhile, on the ground floor of the Baltimore hospital, Grace was reading a printed copy of the report. Someone, likely Marcus, had placed it in her personal mailbox that morning. She read it without blinking, without making notes. She simply held the last page a little longer than the rest. She didn't know how much of the document Marcus had written, but she knew one thing. That precise, restrained tone couldn't have come from a typical writer. It came from someone who had seen the system from the inside and had also quietly endured its decay. That afternoon, a group of young nurses posted a copy of the report in the staff lounge, not as an act of protest, but as an invitation. Let people read and think for themselves. No one removed it. No one was called into HR. But within 4 hours, the hospital's internal comms team issued a directive. Temporarily refrain from sharing, printing, or discussing unverified materials within hospital premises. Ironically, the directive tripled the PDF circulation by the evening. At a Boston branch, a team of physicians organized a session titled Clinical Practice and Courage Within the System. No one mentioned Grace. No one mentioned Marcus. But everyone knew what was unfolding was the first domino triggered by a brick no one had ever noticed before. That evening, Marcus didn't return to his rental apartment. He sat alone in the old records room, beneath a flickering fluorescent light, next to a cold coffee. On his laptop was an unsent draft, Phase 2 report, evaluating real-world clinical ethics models. His cursor hovered over the opening line. There are truths that don't need to be proven. They only need to be illuminated. He hadn't hit send yet, but he already knew, ever since the first email was sent, logoless and nameless, this system would never be the same again. 5 days after the logoless report was circulated across the Zenith Care network, no one, not even Marcus, could have predicted what would follow. The silence began to fracture, not with protests, not with slogans, not with loud outrage, but with quiet voices from people who had once believed they were nothing more than shadows inside a massive machine. People who had once bowed their heads. Now they began to stand. It started with a single sheet of A4 paper pinned to the staff board in the ICU break room at the Pittsburgh branch. On it, a line of handwritten text in neat, slanted handwriting, clearly a man's. I stayed silent when I saw a patient's admission time edited to lower our average treatment time. That day I said nothing. Today I know I was wrong. There was no name. But within 3 hours, 9 more slips of paper appeared pinned around it, each a short confession. No names, no accusations. But everyone knew they were true. That time I was told to mark no complications, even though the patient's blood pressure dropped after the injection. I laughed when a resident called an immigrant patient a complicated case. I didn't correct him. I'm not laughing now. I stayed quiet when I saw a physician pushed out of a meeting for questioning a misallocated equipment code. He resigned a week later. In Baltimore, where Grace still came to work every morning as if the disciplinary meeting had never happened, a young nurse slipped a handwritten letter into her mailbox. No return address, no signature. I used to think you were strict, old-fashioned. Now I realize you were the only one with the courage to hold on to principles in a place where everyone else was afraid of losing their spot. At the bottom in pencil was a note. I'm the one who printed that report for the night shift team. In Boston, a group of interns launched something called the Honesty Minute, a voluntary 15-minute window at the end of each shift where staff could say anything they had once believed wasn't allowed. It began with 2 people, then 8, then 16. No one forced it. But one voice often led to 3 others realizing they too had been unnecessarily silent. In Seattle, a senior technical coordinator quietly released the original maintenance logs for the past 3 months, data that had previously been edited for the financial report. The original logs revealed that over 40% of respiratory care devices were past calibration deadlines. Attached was a single sentence. I don't want to be remembered as someone great with numbers, but blind to ethics. Inside the executive offices, emergency meetings multiplied. They didn't call it a crisis. They called it internal psychological instability. But what they feared most was this. There was no leader to punish this time, no symbol to destroy, and no lie strong enough to suppress people who no longer needed banners to recognize the truth. Marcus received dozens of messages from employees he'd never met, sent from personal emails from hidden numbers. No one asked for a job. No one begged for anonymity. They just wanted to share. One man said his retired nurse mother read the report posted at their hospital and cried. Another shared how she quit her job after being forced to sign off on a fully functioning device she knew was faulty. I thought I quit because I was weak. Now I see, I just couldn't keep betraying what I knew was right. Grace made no public statement. She didn't write op-eds. She didn't attend groups. She still came in on time, still checked on each patient, still quietly scribbled observations in her notebook. But she was no longer alone. One morning she entered the early staff meeting room and found a cup of unsweetened tea, her usual, already waiting on her desk. Next to it, a small handwritten note. Not everyone forgets. Thank you for not leaving while the rest of us are still learning to stand. At HR meetings on the upper floors, the same executives who once ignored reports now stammered when asked, "When was the last time you refused to participate in a policy violation?" No one dared answer, "Never," because now silence was its own form of guilt, and everyone was beginning to understand. At the Denver headquarters, an executive resigned. In his letter, he wrote, "I thought I was good at managing losses, but the greatest loss was letting myself become the kind of person I once warned others to avoid." Marcus sat in the old records room where he had once quietly traced the earliest signs. He was drafting a new message, not a report, but a note for those who hadn't spoken yet. You're not alone. Every truth, no matter how small, is stitching back together what the system once tore apart. The message bore no name. It was sent from a shared system account. But every word rang true. And the strangest part, no one at the hospital asked who sent it, because for the first time, people cared more about the message than the messenger. In the dusty archive room of the Baltimore hospital, where Grace often sat at the end of her shift, afternoon sunlight streamed through the foggy window, casting a long streak across the old tile floor. She was flipping through old notes, reports once ignored, recommendations never answered. But this time, she underlined a line, not as a warning, but as a keepsake. The day medicine returns to what it was meant to be won't be the day the system changes, but the day the people inside it stop bowing their heads. 8 a.m., Monday. The main conference room on the 21st floor of Zenith Care's Denver headquarters was packed. The invitation list included 40 names, but nearly 70 people had shown up. There weren't enough chairs, but no one complained. Some had come early to get a seat, but many, especially doctors, nurses, and technicians, chose to stand along the walls. They didn't stand because there were no chairs. They stood because they refused to sit. They stood as a declaration. This time they weren't there to listen. They were there to speak. The air in the room was thick, like smoke before a blaze. No one cracked a joke. No one whispered. The tension wasn't fear. It was the kind of silence that holds its breath before an eruption. After the moderator finished reading the attendee list, the door opened one final time, and in walked Marcus, not wearing his old temporary interpreter badge, not in a hospital coat. Just a simple ash-gray suit, walking with calm, eyes steady. Everyone knew then. No more pretending. He wasn't playing an outsider anymore. Marcus didn't take the podium. He stood in the middle of the room. I'm not using slides and I won't be reading a report. I'm not here to present. I'm here to confirm. Yes, I'm the one responsible for releasing the anonymous report. A few people inhaled sharply. Some exchanged quick glances. Marcus remained composed. I didn't do it to cause chaos. I did it because the chaos already existed. It was just dressed up as professionalism and hidden behind meetings like this. Mr. Walker, the regional director, cut in. You don't have the authority to launch an internal investigation without board approval. Marcus turned to the screen. You're right. He took out his phone and sent a command. The screen lit up with a message. Official notice. Marcus Lee appointed interim CEO of the Zenith Care System by authorization of the founding council, effective immediately. Silence, deep and long. Starting today, I'm initiating an independent third-party investigation into our equipment handling, resource allocation, and reporting culture across our 5 primary branches. All employees have the right to submit confidential input. Any form of retaliation, even indirect, will result in immediate suspension of management privileges. Some people left the room, but unlike previous meetings, it wasn't the doctors, nurses, or residents who walked out. This time, it was branch directors. They didn't say a word, but their message was clear. They did not approve. Marcus didn't stop them. He turned to those who remained. I'm not asking for your support. I'm asking for one thing. If you've seen something wrong, don't stay silent. The meeting ended without minutes. No, thank you for coming. No applause. But as people filed out of the room, they looked at one another. And for the first time, no one looked down. That afternoon, Grace received an email from a new address, ethics@zenithcare.org. Subject, initiating verification of internal community feedback. Inside was an invitation, not to defend, but to advise. Marcus didn't call her, didn't persuade her, but in the notes section, he had written, I can't change everything, but maybe if we walk together, we won't repeat the past. Grace read it, then printed it. She placed the paper on the tea table in the staff lounge, set her water glass on top so it wouldn't fly away, then went to work, as she always did. That afternoon, something had shifted in the hospital corridors. No one raised their voices, no one asked questions, but the footsteps were more even, unhurried, unapologetic. They had spent years sitting, listening to others speak. Now they chose to stand. And when no one sits quietly to hear things they no longer believe, that's when a system begins to change. 3 weeks after the high-level meeting where Marcus officially stepped forward and announced a full internal investigation into Zenith Care's system, the first preliminary report was released. No logo, no preamble, just a single sentence printed at the top in bold, medium-sized font. This is not a report to help someone keep their seat, but to help all of us keep our conscience. The report was 46 pages long, built on evidence from over 120 staff members, nearly 300 internal documents and system access logs, a long list of things everyone had known, but no one had dared to write down. Mistakes deliberately left uncorrected, voices that had been cut off, treatments abandoned because of quota targets, and the names of those who had been forced out for speaking truths no one wanted to hear. On the day the report was distributed, every Zenith Care conference room, from Baltimore to San Francisco, hung the same sheet of white paper. No title, just a quote from Marcus, centered, if this system was once built wrong by those in power, it will be rebuilt by those who were once silenced. Below each sheet was a blank line, where employees could sign their names if they chose to commit to being part of the change. No one was required to sign, but within 72 hours, more than 4,800 handwritten signatures appeared across the system. No digital forms, no copy-paste names. Meanwhile, on the 6th floor of Zenith Care's Baltimore headquarters, where the old Clinical Ethics Training Center used to be, the dusty door plaque that once read "Storage" had been removed. Marcus called it the door waiting to be properly named. That Friday, an internal email went out. Next Monday, the new center will reopen. It will be led by Dr. Grace Ellery. Any staff member, regardless of rank, role, or tenure, may sign up for trial sessions. On day 1, 14 people registered. On day 2, it was 73. By day 4, the center ran out of seats. That door, once shut down by an administrative decision 4 years ago, now had to stay open all day for the stream of people coming and going. Grace didn't begin with theory. She opened the first session by sharing how she was once invited to step away from a reform project for being too stubborn. She didn't criticize anyone, didn't assign blame. She simply said, I didn't stay because I was better than anyone. I stayed because I couldn't live with myself if one day I looked in the mirror and saw someone who had collaborated by staying silent. Marcus stood in the back of the room, attending silently. He didn't speak, just watched. And for the first time in many months, he no longer felt like a stranger inside the very system he'd helped build. In the 3rd week, a group of medical residents proposed a new seminar topic. When is it right to oppose the person giving orders? A question that once would have been taboo in medicine. Now it was the official subject of study. By the end of the month, another white sheet circulated to all staff. Again, no pressure to sign. But this time, no lines were left blank. Beneath the sentence, "I promise not to stay silent when I see something wrong," were thousands of handwritten names. And at the bottom, one final line appeared, added in neat, round handwriting in blue ink. "Thank you for not locking the door forever." Marcus saw that line late at night as he passed the sixth-floor corridor alone. He stopped, stood still for a long time. He didn't take a picture, didn't save a copy. He just nodded once and walked on. The last hallway light flickered, but inside the center, the light stayed on. And that, above all, was the biggest difference. Wednesday morning, 6:48 a.m. The hallway on the sixth floor of the training center was still empty. A plain envelope, no name, no seal, no logo, had been slipped under the door as quietly as a breeze slipping through the crack between two silences. Grace arrived early. She was always the first to turn on the lights, check her notebook, rinse out the tea flask, and write a few lines on the board. That morning, as she pushed open the heavy wooden door and bent to pick up the envelope, she had no idea that in her hand was the beginning of a new chapter. Not in any plan drawn by Marcus, nor in any blueprint designed by the system's advisors. The letter was written in blue ink, a man's handwriting, clear, precise, but slightly slanted, as though the writer had paused several times. It was just under a page long. "I remember seeing you removed from the ethics hearing room 4 years ago. I stood by the door. I heard every word that cut you off, every line. We don't need an ethics lecture right now." I didn't speak. I thought maybe, as an IT staffer, it wasn't my place. But yesterday, when I saw your name placed on the new training center, I realized something had finally returned to its rightful place. And I thought, I should say this, even if it's late. Grace folded the letter and placed it in the pocket of her white coat. She didn't tell anyone, but all that day, in the tone of her voice as she led the training sessions, there was something different. Not in the content. She still spoke of principles, of moral instincts, of the space between right and more right. But her gaze had softened. Her words carried the resonance of someone who finally knew she was being heard, not just speaking into stone. That afternoon, Marcus came to the center. He brought a reform training blueprint nearly 100 pages long, detailed, structured, planned over an 18-month timeline. But the first page held no title like directive or policy update. It simply read, "This document is offered for reading and open to contribution." Grace took the binder, flipped through the pages. After nearly 10 minutes, she asked, "Are you doing this to fix the system or to redeem yourself?" Marcus didn't answer right away. He looked out toward the window, where early autumn leaves were brushing gently against the glass. "I used to believe I was smart enough to build a strong system, but I was wrong. The system doesn't need to be stronger. It needs to be kinder. And that, I can't do alone." The meeting lasted 2 hours. No recording, no press, no interpreters. But the next day, the plan was updated. At the end of every section, a new line had been added. Amended per suggestion from GE. The final page included a small chart illustrating a flat feedback model, where a first-year medical student had the right to challenge the chief operating officer if they sensed ethical boundaries were being crossed. In one of the following training sessions, a 29-year-old nurse shared, "I used to think ethics was something you only discussed in textbooks. Now I realize it's what made me come back to the hospital after my worst shift ever." A supply chain manager who had never attended a single training session before unexpectedly signed up. When asked why, he simply said, "I used to think I had nothing left to learn, but then I read the report and saw my name appear. Not directly, but enough to make me reconsider everything." The sixth-floor hallway had become more than a place of training. It became a place where people came to ask questions they had long been afraid to ask. And among all those words stood an invitation with no name, but one louder than any official appointment that had ever been issued before. Monday morning, the first week of December. Baltimore turned cold early. Thin gusts of wind slipped through the cracks of glass windows, carrying a chill that stung slightly, but pleasantly. 3 months after the training center had resumed operation, everything seemed to be back in rhythm. But everyone inside the system knew this wasn't a return. It was a beginning, built on the ruins of what came before. That week, a brief notice appeared on every internal screen across the Zenith Care network. This Friday at the Baltimore Auditorium, there will be a system-wide gathering. Theme: the final promise. No further explanation, no attachment, no promotional poster. And yet, the message felt like a signal. Across the system, from executives to newly hired interns, everyone understood. Something was closing. Not with a full stop, but with a long, steady note, like a pause in music before the symphony shifts key. The auditorium had no flowers, no LED screens, no guest list, just a long table draped in white cloth and a single large sheet of white paper placed in the center. In bold, simple blue ink, "I promise not to remain silent when what is right is being left behind." Beneath it, blank space. No checkbox, no options, no instructions, just a blank, like the pause between two breaths. And then, one by one, they stepped forward. A young nurse wrote, "I promise not to look away if someone is shamed just for speaking with an accent." A janitor wrote, "I promise not to stay silent if I see an elderly patient being dismissed." A surgeon using black ink wrote, "I promise to ask questions even if the order comes from above." A medical intern, in small slanted letters, "I promise to keep my heart open for every single shift." A finance officer wrote, "I promise never to prioritize numbers over human lives." An ambulance driver wrote, short and firm, "I promise to arrive at the right place, both in direction and in principle." They didn't just write. They read what others had written. Some stood in silence for a long time before picking up the pen. Some wrote only one word: listen. Some signed their name, title, and department. Others simply drew a small circle, as if to say, "I'm not used to writing, but I'm here." Marcus came last. He had been at the auditorium since morning, but stood quietly at the back of the room. He observed. No filming, no speech, no suit. Just a gray shirt, sleeves rolled slightly. When most had left, he stepped to the table, read every line, stopped for a long time at the one that said, "I promise not to look away when the food delivery staff is referred to by a number." He picked up the pen and wrote in neat, even letters, "I promise to never forget why I started." Then he signed it. Marcus. No title. That afternoon, when the hall was nearly empty, Grace remained. In her hands was the first printed copy of the commitments, saved for archival. No edits, no formatting, no summaries, just the entries, printed in the order they were written. She read line 118, "I promise not to let the next generation begin again from the ashes of our silence." She placed her hand on the sentence, closed her eyes, held still, then smiled. There was no official ending, no bell, no recap video, only real hands, writing the things people were once afraid to say. Only one promise, echoed by hundreds of voices, but spoken from the same heart. And that was why they stayed. Maybe you're watching this from somewhere quiet. Maybe you're thinking, it's just a story. But somewhere out there, someone is still writing their first promise. With a trembling hand, a quiet voice, and a heart that's been ignored too long. We can't change a system with just a video. But if each of us promises not to stay silent when something's wrong, if we choose to stand instead of sit, then change won't come from policies. It will come from courage. If this story moved you, if it made you believe in kindness again, made you angry for the right reasons, or simply made you want to care more about the work you do, there are still so many doors left to open and so many voices ready to speak.